Okay, so in part C we're going to just quickly look at education and the workplace as institutions. I haven't done a strict history, structure, culture, sociological imagination on each of these. I feel like we're sort of getting through a lot of material here. So let's just think about education here as an agent of socialisation. Now think about how many people this affects. Of 20 million population of Australia, 20% of children at school, and there are 2 million students in post-secondary education. The school system determines who will proceed to post-secondary education, and the ideology is that it's based on ability, that it rewards merit, that the best people get through. What we know is that rates of success vary greatly by race and class and gender. So it isn't really rewarding ability in the way that it claims. I don't have the time here to do a whole history of education, but in the normal course of events we would do the history of the institution and how it changed and where it grew from and so on. So education is another way that society reproduces itself. How does it do this in sort of structural terms? If we think about the structures, race and class and gender, we'll think of ethnicity first, or race. The school system in Australia is all English, it's spoken in English, it teaches white European history, it talks about us in terms of history going back to England, and we first arrived here in 1788. Of course there's more Indigenous history taught these days than when I was at school, but there's still a dominant story about white Australian history. And think about what that means for a multicultural society. If we're talking about Gallipoli as an important national holiday, and Anzac Day, how does that fit, say, with the experience of being Turkish in Australia? When we were over there fighting the Turks, there's a very different meaning for people from other parts of the world. Gender, well, traditionally gender was taught in a completely separate curriculum. It's only relatively recently we've had a big push to have girls can do anything, girls going into science and engineering and so on. But when I was growing up, even there was the ends of this, so we're talking the 1980s, there was the end, still a separation. You could still do home economics, and boys did woodwork and girls did home economics, and were directed at very gender separate ways of living. Of course, in the previous generation of mine, it was even much more specific. It was, women were told to do homecraft and sewing, and men did woodwork and metalwork. We know in a class basis that families with higher incomes spend more than 3 times that of middle incomes. There are more private schools in wealthier areas, and school leavers from government schools are 3 times more likely to be unemployed. It evens out when you get to university. There are far fewer working class people at university than middle class people, but the results at university are not determined by class background. So that tells you that there is something going on at the school system level that filters out working class families. It's not about actual ability, because when they get to university they perform equally well, but the difference is in how many get there. There's quite a big literature on the hidden curriculum, and when they say that you'll forget everything, most of what you ever learned at school, but the habits of obedience will stay with you for a lifetime. Now that's a little bit one-sided, I guess, but you get the sort of idea. It naturalises competition. It takes competition for marks and competing with others as individuals as the norm. The purpose, to a very large extent, is the idea too that there is one right answer to a question, and that one right answer is available from the authority figure in front of the class, and your role as a student essentially is to guess the right answer. Now that's a parody as well, but I think it's a familiar enough pattern in schools, and we try to resist that at university, but very much so with mass education systems, it's more and more moving in that direction. So that's the structures around education. More recent cultural shifts, which overlap with structures, of course, but with the debate in the 80s, before the 80s, very much focused on equality and how to improve outcomes for working class children. The Whitlam government had free education, free university education, so there were attempts to equalise it, but it's staunchly resisted. The Gonski reforms, for instance, are challenged and even though the premise of the Gonski report is that all children should get a basic, the same amount with loadings for disability or disadvantage of some kind. Private schools who are proportionally funded more do not, are resisting that process. With economic rationalism or neoliberalism, we've seen a move to, unemployment was blamed not on the economy but on schools. The Carmichael report made it explicit that the purpose of the university system in particular was to serve the needs of industry, that arts and culture and critical thinking and those sort of things were only relevant to the extent that they were required by industry. Schools, we see more and more schools putting courses in that direction with people doing work experience and so on. We've reduced the amount we spent on education. In 96, 41% of money was spent on the private school system, even though, and that's expected to be 34% despite the fact that 70% of children are in public schools. So there's a disproportionate amount spent on private schools for the number of students they had, and at university, of course, you'd all be familiar with user pays. Education was once seen as a right. The government should provide you with an education. Nowadays, it began in 87 with Bob Hawke introducing a $250 charge, but as you've seen gradually over time, there's the HEC scheme, $1,800 per subject, $2,500 a subject. There's more and more fees, which of course then means that students have to work in order to pay that back, or work to go to university, which means there's less face-to-face classes. It's cheaper to deliver that material online, and so universities themselves start to run as a business, and that, like any business, you try to minimise your inputs and maximise your outputs, and so that sees grade inflation and pressure to inflate grades, pressure to pass students who are now no longer students who are there to learn, but to get a credential, to get a piece of paper, and because they're paying, they're now customers rather than students. So there's a very big shift in the culture there. Moving now to the workplace. Workplace is where you're going to spend about a third of your life, so that's an important institution. If we look at this through the sociological imagination lens again, how is working in a modern capitalist economy different from the past? Well, in the past, working people produced the things they needed more or less directly. They owned some means of production, some way of producing the things they needed: clothes, food, shelter. They might have clubbed in, worked at a village level or whatever. Peasants had their own land. Even if they had to give up some to the Lord, or to go and work on the Lord's land one day a week or something, we could see that's a very different way of living to the one way of working to the one we do. In Australia, you think of pre-colonisation, people lived off the land, but in colonisation it was subsistence level. Today, almost no one does that. Your clothes are made in China, food's grown by giant corporations, they own the means of production, not you, and you're forced, in order to make a living, you're forced to sell yourself to a major corporation in order to get the money you need to buy the things you need. So you're not producing the things you need. It's not, the purpose of the system isn't to be used. You don't work to produce something you need. You work to produce a commodity that can be sold for a profit, and it doesn't make any difference what needs that meets, because as I explained in the previous lecture about the culture, we can create those needs. Marketing creates a huge demand for things that are not needs. The commodity only is produced in order to sell it, not in order for you to use it, or even the boss. The boss doesn't use it either, or the board of directors. There's always been a small amount of trade and buying and selling. There's no doubt that people always did that, but it didn't dominate the way it does in market societies. Under capitalism, it's so common we think it's natural that things should be made and sold for a profit. And then, of course, we read that into history. Adam Smith said, the famous Scottish philosopher and early economist, said it's in man's nature to truck, barter and exchange. Is in man's nature, which of course denies the 650 lifetimes for a start and a good deal of the rest, where market societies were not the dominant form of interaction. So we get wages to buy what we need, and capitalism does that, employs us in order to make a profit out of our labour. So it's a central institution in society. The fundamental driver of that society is the accumulation of capital, and the way to do that is to maximise profit. Ironically, of course, it's the workers that produce all the value in a society. They receive a portion of this value as wages from the sale of commodities. By that I just mean, if you think about it for a moment, at a collective level, I mean not at an individual level, but at a collective level, the people who you work with at your business must be collectively contributing more value to the firm and to the boss than he pays you or she pays you in wages. Because if that's not happening, then the business is going to go broke. So it must by definition be paid less. And we don't think it's strange that in a capitalist society we produce something, and then the boss owns the something that he then sells. Historically that's been unusual. If you produce something, that means you owned it and somebody bought it from you. But in a capitalist society you don't own what you produce. If you work in a big car factory and you and your work crew produce a car in the course of the day, you don't own that car. The boss owns the car, and you get a wage for that car. And again, that's something that's hard to imagine that has only existed for a couple of lifetimes. So, in a sort of simple Marxist framework, and I think this gets to grips with some of the dynamics of society. Of course, it's not the whole story, but Marx said you start with this. What's the basic dynamic in that society and that class structure? You've got two great classes: the people who own the factories and the means of production, the way the society produces its goods and services, and you've got the people who work those machines and those businesses in order to make the things that are there for sale. Now, there are all sorts of intervening classes. I don't fit neatly as an academic into that. There are lots of small businesses that don't fit neatly into that. Lots of workers in the government bureaucracy who don't quite fit neatly into that. But broadly speaking, and there are giant corporations which aren't owned by individuals. It's easy to tell the story as the boss who owns the thing and the workers. So it's complicated. But I think there's a basic dynamic there between those who own, maybe through shares or families, that own these huge corporations and the people who work in them. So the owners are modern capitalists, and they own the means of production, and in order to survive in our society you have to sell yourself to them so they can make a profit out of your labour. Now, so again, it's more complicated because we have a welfare state that we fought for, and you're not going to starve on the street. But if you went back to the pure 19th century capitalism, then if you couldn't sell yourself, you're in the poorhouse. And maybe the church would give you a pittance to live on or some food, but essentially if you couldn't sell yourself to the capitalist, then you didn't have a means of production. You weren't like a peasant who had a piece of land. It was very hard to survive. And the working class is wage labourers who don't have any means of production of their own and sell their labour in order to live. Profits come from the difference between what's paid for labour and the exchange value of the commodity. So what it gets in exchange. So naturally enough, you maximise profit to, minimise your cost of inputs, so that they're as cheap as possible, so you can sell as many as possible, and as much as possible. The materials need to be cheap. The labour needs to be as cheap as possible. You need as few labourers as possible. This sort of idea that capitalists are job producers is just a misunderstanding of how the system operates. Yes, they provide work. They provide work up to the point where they no longer make a profit out of you, and they naturally seek to minimise the amount of labour that they have to use in order to get the job done, because labour is expensive. And as much as possible, pollution, if we think of environmental issues, as much as possible you don't want to pay for that pollution, so it goes into the atmosphere, it goes into the streams. And again, we've got some regulations on that now, but in its purest form, you minimise your cost by the waste products and the pollution going somewhere else where you don't have to pay for, into the commons, as I call it, into the atmosphere, into landfill, into the rivers. And the important thing, of course, is that you need to keep control of that labour force. They've got to do what you tell them, and they have an interest in working as little as possible and doing the minimum that they can. And so you want them to work longer and harder for less, increasing productivity, as they say, or flexible labour. They come and go as you please. ironically, of course, you also want them to consume more and more. So there's a contradiction in the system, in the capitalist system, where as an individual business owner or capitalist, I want my workers to get paid as little as possible, but I want them to consume. I want as many workers outside of my factory to consume as much as possible. So I have an interest in keeping my wages low, but in the wages of everyone else high. So it exhorted it to, at the same time, to work harder and longer for less and less, and at the same time to consume more and more. So that's a contradiction in the system, and the contradictions are what drive the system forward and create social change. So lots of work goes into control and management effort. There's a whole science of Taylorism about minimum work effort and minimum movement, and the job's being de-skilled and as simple as possible so that anyone can be put in those positions, because if someone has a key skill, then they're able to hold up production or increase their wage by saying, well, I want to be paid more, and if they're essential to that process. So you try to remove those kind of blocks. Any kind of barrier needs to be overcome to make the system as smooth flowing as possible. It's important that workers comply to the rules of management, so that's where those habits of obedience at school are so important. Notice that there's no democracy at work. There's no even conception that there should be economic democracy. So that liberty, equality, fraternity, and the need for democracy and rights doesn't include work. There's no conception that workers who spend a third of their life at work should have any input into how the job's done, or minimal input into how the job's done. They're not allowed to challenge the rights of management. The managers decide how and what will be produced and where, and not, and in principle, workers have no say in that. So there's no notion of democracy at work. And conversely, of course, it's subordination. You want to keep the workers under control and as passive, but you want them to change. This varies, of course. In the 50s and 60s, it was very common to try to keep workers' loyalty, because you had a large workforce that you trained and invested in, so you wanted that workforce to stay with you as long as possible, and so we had those systems of rewards, a golden handshake for long service and a gold watch and so on. But now capitalism is much more focused on change and niche marketing and much leaner forms of production, so there's much more focus on flexibility. And so now we want workers that are accommodating to change. So the buzzword for that, of course, is lifelong learning. Lifelong learning means that you'll be expected to reskill and retool. You won't get that training from your boss. That'll be your responsibility, and loyalty will not be a factor. They won't owe you anything. It's just a straightforward monetary exchange. And I see around town, it's surprising that I'd see young workers on casual contracts who then announce they're not going into work on a given day, and the boss complains that these people aren't loyal to the firm. It's as if he were loyal to them. So there's no quid pro quo, but there's still that expectation that somehow people are owed loyalty to a business that no longer sees them in anything but casual terms. So there's no holidays, no sick pay, no guaranteed work going forward. More broadly, I think it's worth just mentioning in terms of culture the interesting ideas of George Ritzer about McDonaldization of society, and the way in which that industrial mass production of society, that we could talk about it in relation to agriculture, but particularly also with food. So we see McDonald's, it's like a giant factory for food. So we have a standardized product, we break it down, we have women on the front desk, we have men out the back, and there's 2 minutes for every burger, and it's all put together. Now it's become a more lean and mean sort of operation, but very much about mass production of food, and it means controlling the whole production line, and these enormous institutions that do an almost, well, they certainly work nationally in Australia, but are global corporations that are able to deliver products very cheaply, mass produced, of course, not considering the health effects on people or the environmental effects of these kind of mass-produced products. Very different from 50 years ago, where this demand for takeaway food was much less. If there was takeaway food, then it was fish and chips or maybe the local Chinese, but they were on special occasions, and they were local shops with their own particular way of doing things. Not every fish and chip shop was identical. Not every Chinese restaurant was identical. Whereas now we have, you know, anywhere in Australia and eat a McDonald's, probably nearly anywhere in the world and eat a McDonald's and find it's much the same. And again, you've got the same process of de-skilling. I mentioned some of those changes in work. Businesses 20, 30 years ago, they weren't open 24 hours, so there was only nighttime work for Thursday nights and Saturday mornings when shops opened after hours, and that work was filled by a generation of school people doing after school hours work. Whereas now shops are open 24/7, people are expected to come in at short notice, any time of the day or night, all through the weekend, and so of course there's resistance then to what used to be penalty rates for the weekend. A 40-hour week, getting a job for a 40-hour week doesn't mean what it used to mean, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. It now means 40 hours as and when you're required. And then there's other aspects of it too. I see young people who are given managers' jobs, which essentially means they have to stay behind after hours to lock up, but they're not given any significant increase in pay or any likelihood of being promoted up the hierarchy, but they're called managers and given a sort of flash title, but it really just means they work for longer for the good of the firm, really. The other one I've mentioned a couple of times, I just touched on it here, was the Protestant work ethic. That's an important part of capitalist culture. You know, aside from the history and the structure, you've got this other cultural aspect apart from the sort of way those norms permeate society in terms of mass production, commodification of everyday life and so on. The Protestant work ethic that Weber talked about, you know, perhaps is breaking down now. I think work is still a very important form of identity for people, although they might expect to change more often than they did in the past. And what Weber's looking at, of course, was, you know, the genesis of capitalism that required people to work hard and not spend and be frugal, and so that the system could develop. But once we got on top of all those problems of production, then all that story of consumption that I told earlier in the lecture started to kick in. So you might be argued that the Protestant work ethic is breaking down these days, and it's much more a leisure ethic. The other thing that's important in the institution of work that I didn't mention was divisions by race and gender. Different ethnic groups and women are valued differently in the economy, and they do shit work, they're paid less, and so that impacts on their social status and reinforces their low social status. So women have traditionally been paid less than men, and even though they have formally equal pay, as a group they're still paid less. If you look at, you know, ethnicity, then you see that there are, you know, ethnic groups are assigned lower status work. Well, I think that's enough about culture and institutions, and I think hopefully you've got enough to, you know, get you thinking outside the box like I try to do, but also to bring some of that to your interviews and start to think about, you know, the specifics of the agents of socialization that people go through. The family, work and school, the predominant ones. Maybe you could do more. The church might be one, for instance. And then you might think more laterally about disability and so on. But those are three key ones that virtually everybody goes through. And next time we're going to look at more specifically at the structures, the social structures we're interested in doing the analysis of, like class and race and gender. So we'll go over these in a slightly different way. I was reminded during the week, though, before I finish up, of 7-Up. Now, if you haven't heard about 7-Up, I should have probably told you this earlier. 7-Up is a series of documentary shows that started in 1964 and was based on previous mass observation studies in a sort of British documentary tradition of trying to catalogue the working life of people and to catalogue the class structure and how it worked. So I'll just show you this promo. The latest one has just come out is 56. And so the first lot was in 1964 and there was 7. And they took a cohort through and they go back every 7 years. But anyway, I'll show you this video.
The idea of looking at a bunch of people over time and how they evolve, that was a really nifty idea.
I didn't want to do it when I was 14, and I vowed I'd never do it now, but here I am.
Hopefully I'll reach my half century next year and I shall bow out. I suppose I have this ridiculous sense of loyalty to it, even though I hate it, and that's just such a contradiction, isn't it?
I don't want to answer those kind of questions.
37 years. Gone extremely quickly. We've just grown together.
I don't think you really notice it. I mean, you still think you're the same. It's maybe when you pull a muscle, that just reminds you that you're getting older. I always liked older people as I was growing up, funny enough.
My ambition as a scientist is to be more famous for doing science than for being in this film, but unfortunately, Michael, it's not going to happen.
Michael, up there is my old flats where I used to live in. I lived up there for 28 years. The memories I've got in here is unbelievable.
It's how a person, any person, how they change. It's not an absolute accurate picture of me, but it's a picture of somebody.
Yeah, so that's an enormously rich resource, and we could build a whole series of classes around that series alone, and follow the threads through of gender. There's not so much about race, but certainly gender and class are very clear, and the different ways. It's good too for that question about choice, and because it shows to what extent the starting point isn't even, and the way that the culture and the structures shape the behaviour and the choices that people are given. And of course they're not prisoners of it, but you can see how it shapes their lives to a very large extent. So it's well worth putting some time into watching as many of those. They're all online, so you'll find the link to all the documentaries on the website. But it's certainly well worth looking at any amount of 7-Up that you can get your hands on. So don't forget the reflection on the question I asked you about. I talked about in the first part of the lecture about the importance of rituals and how rituals and the culture reproduce the social order. I didn't actually address the question of who creates those stories. I mean, of course I've got a bit of an answer already, I guess, but what would you think of as the key rituals in our society, and how would you who would you say is telling the stories and so on? And there's the references. I think I've covered all of those. I think I've got all the references, although we could make an argument for some others. I've made some passing references to other texts, so maybe they should go in my conclusion as well, in my reference list rather. So I'll leave you to think about that, and I shall see you next week.